alluded and discussed that the month of Muharram, even before Islam had officially been revealed as a religion, it was one of the most, it was the month of sanctity, along with the months of Rajab, Zil-Qa'dah, Zil-Hijjah. And so it was a month where no one would battle. And you shared an example of, even if you saw the killer of your father, you'd still wait out of the sanctity of the month. And therefore, Sheikh, before we kind of start with today's session on a slightly different topic, is there anything that you'd like to elaborate on a point that was made previously?
Yeah, just to summarize last week's discussion. Obviously, when we speak about the month of Muharram and the history of the month of Muharram, it's interesting because in Hajjatul Wada', in the last and farewell Hajj, the first and last Hajj of the Holy Prophet of Islam, when he speaks about, or when he delivers his sermon. Now, the sermon that he delivers in Hajjatul Wada' is interesting because he highlights a number of different areas, problems within the community and how to address those problems. And in one area, he speaks about the month of Muharram, right? So he opens up a dialogue with the people and he asks them, he says, "O companions, what month is this?" And they say, "This is the month in which warfare and killing and shedding blood has been prohibited and is unlawful." Upon which the Prophet says, he says that your blood and your property is unlawful and it's made respectable for one another, not only in this month but outside of this month, right? And this land is respectable and it has been a land which bloodshed has been prohibited, transgression has been prohibited, just like the months outside of this month as well. So it highlights the importance of how great the month of Muharram was seen even before the coming of Islam. And of course, because of the sanctity that the Quraysh of Mecca had, Islam kind of took it on board, and its sanctity was preserved even within the Sharia of Islam. It's a month of change, and so there's that spiritual essence as well within it, the spiritual flavor for it as well, where if you want to really make change, it's not just exclusive to the month of Ramadan, but the month of Muharram as well, the month of the Qa'dah and the Hijjah. These are the months that we can also utilize to create change. Ahsan.
Well, thank you so much, Sheikh. So, in the way of introducing today's topic, the message of Aba Abdullah, the uprising of Aba Abdullah, is one that is prevalent in the hearts of millions. Centuries later, there are millions that flock towards his shrine. There are millions that flock towards the masajid. There are millions that flock to houses and other centers to kind of remember his uprising. And not just in the month of Muharram, but throughout the year, his uprising, his revolution has served an inspiration to many, be it Muslims, but there are also well-documented instances of non-Muslims. And given the prevalency of Imam Hussain alayhi salam's uprising, of course, there are those that do not favor his uprising, and those that try to water down the main aims of his uprising. There are those that may, for instance, try to take the focus away from his core uprising, and whether you may call it the anti-Shia movement or the anti-Hussein movement, regardless of what you may call them, they try and come up with such arguments which try and take our focus away from his real understanding and aim. So therefore, tonight's discussion of the Exposition of Ashura, titled "The Reasons and Motives of Imam Hussain alayhi salam's Uprising." Sheikh, to start us off, why do you think there are movements that exist that try to water down what Imam Hussain alayhi salam stood for, even at this point in time?
So it's a very interesting question. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a very interesting question, and the reason is because these ideas, there's been a lot of information available within the books of our brothers as well, where they share ideas and opinions that Imam Hussain was clearly wrong in what he did, especially when leading a revolt against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the ripples of that can also be seen today, right? So when you go on YouTube and you look at, for example, many of the debates that is out there, and I'm not talking about debates between the Sunni and the Shia, or even the Salafis and the Shia, but even between the Sunnah and the Salafis, you find that there's a lot of disagreement between them and amongst them. The Sunnah, who obviously believe that what Imam Hussain alayhi salam did was absolutely justified. What he did was necessary for the Ummah, and there's a lot of respect given to Imam Hussain alayhi salam from that area. But then the Salafis, they come forward and they say, the hardcore Salafis, they came and they said, no, Yazid had every right to slaughter Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Imam Hussain was wrong to rise against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the reason why that is because it goes back to the hadith of the Holy Prophet, right? And there's a few narrations in this area where the Prophet actually says, he says, you know what? If you come across a leader who is a Ja'ir, Sultan al-Ja'ir, someone who is an unjust leader, someone who is not adil, someone who is a despot, a dictator, referring to the Muslims, he says to them, do not try and lead an uprising against them. Do not try and lead a revolt against them. Why is that? He said the reason is because nothing good will come out of it. It's better for you to sit down and take the oppression and have sabr, have patience, rather than leading an uprising against them. Because when you do lead an uprising against them, what happens naturally is you'll have bloodshed that is followed. The economy will collapse. The political establishments will collapse. It will cause a great imbalance within society itself. The destruction of hospitals and schools and universities, as we're saying today. You look at the example of Syria, for example. Syria was known to be a helm of knowledge, right? Not just Hausawi knowledge, but even secular knowledge as well. And now today, everything is in rubbles. The University of Damascus, the Hausa itself, when the war broke out, many of the teachers kind of migrated to Najaf and Qum. Now Syria is not known for Hausa studies anymore, right? And it's for this reason. In fact, you'll even find clips on YouTube where these Salafis, they honestly very clearly and explicitly say, well, the uprising in Syria was absolutely wrong. Why? It's because of the hadith of the Prophet. Just sit quietly and take everything with sabr, with patience. At least then, you'd have a reasonably functional society. There's an interesting hadith. Let me just read it for you. Hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam. He says, "Man kharaja ala jama'at al-Muslimin faqtuluhu." The one who comes out and leads an uprising against the Jama'ah of the Muslimin, against the Muslimin in general, faqtuluhu. Kill him. Why? Because of the reason that we've just mentioned. And of course, our scholars, and of course, even the scholars amongst the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. What's interesting is that when actually, this is the opinion of the Hanabila as well, right? The people who follow the madhab of Abu Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But at the same time, you have, the followers of the followers of Abu Hanifa, and even amongst the Hanabila themselves, who have taken the other perspective, have taken the other side. So there's a lot of disagreement, like great schisms between themselves. One party which says that you shouldn't revolt against the Jama'at al-Muslimin or the Sultan al-Ja'ir, and then the other, for example, party which says that no, you can, obviously, because they are the manifestations of oppression, and you should obviously try and get rid of them as strategically as possible. Obviously, when the question is raised, well, what do you think? The Ahl Shia, what do you think? Was Imam Hussain alayhi salam justified? We say absolutely he was justified. When you therefore come across these ahadith, one of the things that we need to really do is try and see if it's authentic or not. Let's be honest, history is very dark in this area where people, because of the love of their world, because of the love of wealth and money, did many, silly things to try and justify their evil deeds, for example, especially, and we can trace this back to the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. We can trace it back to the Banu Umayyah in general, even the Bani Abbas. And there's a very, very high chance that this hadith, in fact, it's not even a high chance, we have yaqeen that this hadith is a fabrication in itself. The reason why it's a fabrication is because it goes against many profound ahadith of the Holy Prophet. It contradicts many other ahadith of the Holy Prophet. And of course, it contradicts the Holy Quran as well, right? So it's based on that principle that this hadith is rejected. It's not even taken into consideration at all.
Well, just for the benefit of the viewers, please do put your comments through on the live chat within the YouTube channel. So, Sheikh, thank you for the elaborate introduction. I guess one of the points of arguments that one of those opposing the authentic reform or the real reason why Imam Hussain alayhi salam stood up was they hide behind the reason, like you said, of a political reason, that what Imam Hussain alayhi salam did through his sermons, for example, or his uprising and stand in Karbala was nothing more for political stunt. That
Right,
Imam
yes.
Hussain alayhi salam didn't want to obey the caliph, however just or unjust he may be, and so he stood up against Yazid, the caliph of his time. So firstly, you've already kind of elaborated on where the opinion has come from, and if I was to ask you, how are we able to, other than kind of going into the sanad of the hadith, how are we able to have some evidences to kind of argue against the political stance of Imam Hussain alayhi salam? You mentioned a Quranic ayat.
Yeah. So if you were to refer to the Holy Quran, and before going to the Holy Quran, so it's interesting because the Salafis, they have interpreted this whole saga of Karbala as a political movement, right? That's one of the opinions, to belittle the movement, the holy movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam as a political stance. Then obviously the other opinions include that, you know, Imam Hussain wanted to just become a shaheed, to become a martyr. And of course the position of shuhada is profound according to the language of the Holy Quran. And then you have the third opinion that said, oh, Imam Hussain acted as self-defense. And then obviously the fourth opinion, which we the Shias believe in, is that he wanted to reform the community of his grandfather. So we'll discuss this inshallah as time goes on. But when you refer back to the Holy Quran, you know, when you look at, for example, the position of a hakim al-ja'ir, the Quran speaks about how a person should rule, even specifically in the case when he has been given a leadership position. It says, وَإِذَا حَكَمْتُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ أَن تَحْكُمُوا بِالْعَدْلِ. That when you have this leadership position, when you rule amongst the people, then make sure that you rule with justice. Make sure that you rule with equality or even equity. You know, oppression should not even be part of the formula, especially if you're a leader. وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةً يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. You know, be an ummah which calls people, which invites people towards khair. If you're a leader and you invite people towards evil, obviously that's going against the message of the Holy Quran. وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. That, you know, forbids the evil and creates an environment where good thrives. You know, positivity thrives. People who are in adherence to the, you know, Sharia of Islam. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. Same principles that are there. As a leader, you need to invite people towards adl. You need to treat people with justice. You need to treat people with mercy and kindness. If there is oppression amongst the people, amongst the rulers or the leaders, then obviously some action should be taken. In fact, when you go through, you know, the books of history, you find that the Banu Umayyah, the Banu Abbas, they were ruthless killers. They were oppressive leaders. And, you know, with the infusion with, you know, the fabrication of ahadith, they justified their deeds, their misdeeds. And, you know, the effects are seen even today. You have a ruthless leader, you'll have scholars that say, well, just sit down and have patience, you know, because on the day of judgment, God will reward you for your patience. Whereas the Quran tells us, no, there shouldn't be a ruthless leader in the first place. Right? So it's interesting how this whole discussion has developed over the years, especially over the centuries. And still today, even we find people who are supportive of you know, being in support of an oppressive leader.
Mm.
So it's
And funnily enough, like you said, the factory which manufactured dozens
yeah,
or hundreds of thousands of ahadith.
yeah,
Sometimes it
exactly.
may help one of the caliphs, but it was quite circular and played to the adverse favor of another caliph. For example, Muawiyah,
Mm.
who stood up
Right,
against
right.
Imam Ali alayhi salam. So the hadith that's quoted makes Muawiyah's actions quite unjustified in that sense. So it's
Yeah.
quite circular if those arguments are used in some cases, but not justly in another. So that was one of the first opinions that the argument of how Imam Hussain alayhi salam's uprising is now diluted, of it all being a political stunt against the caliph of the time. The second argument that you mentioned was more of the idea of shahada, of martyrdom. More so, just before we go on the second argument, are you able to quickly elaborate on the evidences that we can actually use against the political argument on how it wasn't a
Yeah,
stunt?
yeah, definitely. So the first theory that talks about Imam Hussein's uprising and the reason behind his revolt was because it was a political movement, and the first person, if I'm not mistaken, to share this opinion was Sheikh al-Tusi, right? So you
Okay.
have even Rahmatullah alayh. So you have even the Shia scholars who entertain this particular theory, but obviously there are reservations to it as well. We have many reservations to this particular theory, and Sheikh al-Tusi, he comes forward and he brings all of the different political evidences, historical evidences that are there to try and prove that this movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was a political movement. So, for example, he says, look, um, when Yazid comes into power, when Yazid forces bay'at from Imam Hussain alayhi salam, one of the first things he does is he goes towards Mecca. When he sees that Mecca is not a safe place to be, he then goes towards Kufa. He says, why does he go towards Kufa? He says he goes towards Kufa because Kufa is a political hub, right? There's a lot of political connotations in Kufa itself. He doesn't go to Yemen, he doesn't go to Egypt, he doesn't go to, for example, the other places in the Arabian Peninsula, but he goes towards Kufa. Now, Kufa developed as a political military base at the time of his father Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. So he moves towards Kufa, right? He sends Muslim ibn Aqil, his cousin, to go towards Kufa and to try and assemble the people, to try and, liven the hearts of the people to fight against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And it was very easy for Muslim ibn Aqil to do that, right? Because Yazid was known to be a fajr. He was known to be an open sinner. He was known to be, completely different and away from religion. Muawiyah was the same, but Muawiyah kind of had it hidden. Even today, you find discussions whether Muawiyah is a believer or a disbeliever. The fact that we have this discussion on Muawiyah shows that he at least he tried to hide it. Whereas Yazid, he didn't even try to hide it. He was completely open about his fusk, his tendency to just be defying of God's law. So Muslim ibn Aqil goes towards the lands of Kufa to try and gather the army. Even that, Muslim ibn Aqil, even he interpreted the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam as a political movement. So he goes towards Kufa. He sends letters to Imam Hussain alayhi salam that come, you have the people's support. The people are here willing to help you. If you come, you rally them up, and they will show you the support that you want. And obviously, when they turn against him, when Ibn Ziyad then comes into Kufa, and he frightens the people, terrorizes the people, offers them bribes and so on and so forth. When Muslim Aqil sees that the hearts of the people have changed, he then sends another letter to Imam Hussain alayhi salam and says, don't come into Kufa anymore. It's not what you thought it was, right? It's not what we thought it was. All of this is just evidence to show that You know, the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was in fact a political movement, right? It just shows that the Imam, the reason why he looked towards Kufa was because there was a lot of support coming in from Kufa. But then obviously, you know, scholars came forward and they said that because the people of Kufa kind of swayed away from that support of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, that's why the Imam ultimately failed. But if Kufa had joined the Imam, then the Imam wouldn't have failed against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, right? But obviously, we have reservations to this particular opinion. We have much more evidences to show that no, this movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was not just a political movement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Swiftly moving to the second kind of argument on how some try to dilute the message by saying the uprising or the stand on the day of Ashura in Karbala was nothing more than Imam Hussain alayhi salam only and only doing it to attain martyrdom.
Yeah.
And obviously romanticizing martyrdom as it should be, but in that way kind of diluting then his message and taking the focus away. So what are the opinions that are formed on that basis? And where does the opinion come from?
The opinion with regards to the political movement.
With regards to Imam Hussain alayhi salam's focus in his uprising was nothing but to attain martyrdom.
Right, okay. Okay, that's an interesting question. That's a very, very interesting question. And there are evidences to this as well, right? So there are evidences to show that Imam Hussain alayhi salam went towards Karbala. He led an uprising against Yazid purely for the sake of receiving martyrdom, right? To become a shaheed. That's actually very
argument
interesting.
That there weren't any people to support him. There were only a handful. So there could have been no other scenario.
Right. So the idea behind this was like, you know, the Imam, as he was in Medina, and when the the order came in that he needs to perform bay'ah to Yazid, he leaves Medina. He goes towards Mecca. He sees that Mecca is unsafe. He goes towards Kufa. He's not there in Kufa. He doesn't reach Kufa, but he's taken to Karbala. So from the very, very beginning, the Imam knew that his mission was not, it wasn't going to be successful, right? Even as a leave aside the fact that he was the Imam, and obviously with that comes knowledge and experience, and you know, even political experience that his father had, even political experience that his brother Imam Hussain alayhi salam had. The Imam knew that, you know, his life was obviously going to be killed. He was going to be killed. He knew that he's going to be slaughtered. There was not a fraction of a chance for him to even fathom the idea of him reaching the caliphates. He knew that he was going to, be killed, right? So this opinion, what it explains is that the Imam, because he knew he was going to be killed, he wanted that martyrdom. Now, before leaving, the evidences to this is found in Nafas al-Mahmum of Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi rahmatullah alayhi, right? And of course other historical books as well. But I refer Nafas al-Mahmum because it's available in English as well. So what he does, the Imam alayhi salam, what he does is before he leaves Medina, he goes towards the grave of his grandfather Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, right? And obviously he's there. He knows it's going to be his final ziyarah, he's in his final, meeting with his grandfather, and he falls unconscious. Now when he's unconscious, he sees his grandfather in his dream. So the Holy Prophet comes towards the Imam alayhi salam, and there's a whole discussion that takes place, a dialogue that takes place between the Imam and his grandfather. Now Rasulullah says to Imam Hussain, he says, فَحَبِيبِي يَا حُسَيْنِ إِنَّ أَبَاكَ وَأُمُّكَ وَأَخَاكَ قَدَّمُوا عَلَيَّ وَهُوَ مُشْتَاقٌ إِلَيْكَ. That, your grandfather, your mother, your father, your brother, we're all missing you. Yeah, we're craving for your presence now. وَأَنَّ لَكَ فِي الْجَنَانِ لَدَرَجَاتٍ لَا تَنَالُهَا إِلَّا بِالشَّهَادَةِ. And you have a specific position in the heavens, and you will not be able to attain this position. You will not be able to reach this position except إِلَّا بِالشَّهَادَةِ, except that if you give your life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then the Prophet says to Imam Hussain, he says, La budda laka min ruju' ila dunya. It's necessary that you go back to this world. Hatta tarzuq shahada, until you are granted shahada, until you are granted martyrdom. وَمَا قَدْ كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَكَ فِيهَا مِنَ الثَّوَابِ الْعَظِيمِ. And through shahada, you will be able to receive the grand rewards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you or has reserved for you. right? So from the very beginning, Imam Hussain alayhi salam had this aspiration of just becoming a shaheed. Um, it's a very interesting opinion that's out there, that's been shared and entertained by our scholars, but obviously it's not the entire motive behind the revolution of Imam alayhi salam, right? It
Hmm.
kind of, there's that, the refutation behind this is that it kind of belittles the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. The Imam alayhi salam, it gives us a hint that the Imam had no other aspirations except for being killed in Allah's way. And of course, as glorified as that is, um, the Imam saw this as an end rather than a means to an end. Do you get me? So,
Hmm.
um, dare I say this? It's as if the Imam didn't anticipate a heavy blowback. You know, uh, Even today, 1400 years later, we still remember the sacrifice of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. We could easily turn around and say, well, the Imam never anticipated his movement to remembered by everyone for every year until the day of judgment. All he wanted to do was reach the stage of martyrdom, right? That it kind of belittles the position of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, especially him being an Imam of Allah, someone who is divinely designated to preserve the deen and to preserve the Sharia of his grandfather. The Imam knew exactly what he was doing, right? The
Hmm.
Imam wanted to preserve the message of his grandfather. To do that, one of the ways of preserving the Sharia of his grandfather was by giving his life. Not that the Imam wanted to give his life and that was it, that's the end of it.
Okay.
It was a means to an end. The end, obviously, being was preservation of Ad-Din al-Islam.
Yeah. So the Shahada, of course, it was something that Imam alayhi salam did attain. But clearly, we now understand that how this opinion has now tried to be put at the forefront to dilute his initial reform and his initial mission and objective. Now, for us wishing to understand this further, what sort of evidences are there that we can use to kind of shift the focus away from this argument?
So historical sources, right? Historical sources tell us that the Imam alayhi salam, one of the most profound evidences that we have to show that the Imam wasn't just looking towards Shahada,
Hmm.
is the sermons that he gave. He gave many sermons from the moment he left Medina, going towards Mecca, from Mecca going towards Karbala. He made it clear to the people that were there with him, right? He made it clear to the people that joined him along the way that this is going to end in death. And the idea being that wait, hold on a second, we're not just looking at death itself, we're looking at a true reformation. We're going to look at the ability to try and revive the nation of Rasulullah, revive the values and the disciplines and the principles of the religion of Islam. And by doing that, we have to give our lives, right? And when you refer to many of the sermons of the Imam alayhi salam, he makes it very clear. He says, look, the motives behind this uprising is not just death itself, it's much more than that.
Hmm.
It's to message in the core of Islam.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a question from a viewer on the live chat at YouTube. The question is as follows: Imam alayhi salam did not win the battle on the battlefield from a physical perspective, but achieved the main objective that Karbala took place for. So he did not win. So he did not win, right, from an objective point of view. So he did not fail. I believe the question is still being written. It's still in its
Right.
typing
Yes. So it's interesting because it's how you view the whole battle of Karbala, isn't it? How you view the whole saga of Karbala. Obviously, when Imam Hussain alayhi salam was slaughtered, people thought that he lost. People
Mm,
interpreted that as Imam Hussain alayhi salam losing. Yazid was, he saw him to be the winner of that battle. But when you go a few years later, you realize that the Banu Umayyah kind of they they were dismantled from its core. They
Yeah.
began to fall. They began to dissipate after Imam Hussain. This is also a very interesting historical discussion. After Imam Hussain slaughter in Karbala in 61st AH after Hijrah, it wasn't long after before the Banu Umayyah began to fall apart.
Yes.
There were many uprisings that took place because they realized the crimes that were committed against the Ahl al-Bayt by the Banu Umayyah. So there were many different uprisings that were taking place. And the last of this uprising was, of course, the uprising of the Bani Abbas against the Banu Umayyah, when the latter kind of slaughters the former. So if you're approaching it from this perspective, Imam Hussain, who was killed on the 10th of Muharram, yeah, you could say, yeah, Imam Hussain lost. But then really, Imam Hussain didn't lose, because he's still being remembered today. His not even that, but his message, his revolution is like an archetype for all movements that call about and is based on justice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi, for example, when he leads an uprising against his oppressors, he uses Imam Hussain as a role model. And of course, many other movements that took place in history. It comes to show that Imam Hussain really was the one who had the upper hand in this battle,
and
from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, and other than Imam Hussain, I mean, you mentioned that Imam Hussain alayhi salam's movement in battle was a catalyst for the failure of Bani Umayyah a couple of years later. But even immediately after the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, I believe it was Ibrahim, the son of Talha, who comes to Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam and says, who's won, who's lost? And Imam Zain al-Abidin directs him to the Adhan and says, go pray 2 rakats of praise.
Yes.
And if you can do that, then clearly the objectives of my father have been met.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. That's one of the answers of Imam Sajjad, wasn't it? When he said, listen to the Adhan, whose grandfather is being mentioned. Yes. And it was like a slap to Yazid's face as well, It's like, listen, what you've done is, you may think that you've won, but far from it, It's interesting. It's very interesting how there's so much evidences in history to show that Imam Hussain alayhi salam was the true valier in Karbala, even though physically he lost, even though physically he was slaughtered.
Yeah. We have had the question on YouTube, the tail of the previous kind of question. The question finishes off. Wasn't his Imam Hussain alayhi salam's martyrdom already spoken about from his time of birth, and I think from even before, by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Yeah, absolutely. So his martyrdom was definitely spoken of. It was prophesied even before his birth. It was prophesied when he was in the womb of Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha. There's a very interesting hadith where one day, when she was pregnant with Imam Hussain alayhi salam, the Holy Prophet, engages in a discussion with her, a dialogue with her, and he says to her that your son will be slaughtered in the plains of Karbala. She cries and she weeps. But then, the Holy Prophet says, but don't worry, from your lineage, there will be a man who will come and he will avenge his death. Upon which, the Holy Lady begins to smile, and she's that remorse, that emotions of sadness is removed from her. And obviously the Prophet was implying the presence of Imam al-Hujjah ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. Even before the Holy Prophet of Islam, there's evidences that even the prophets of Islam before the final prophet of Islam were given the prophecy of what would happen on the 10th of Muharram. And each and every one of them, and we have many narrations behind this as well. When you refer to Bihar al-Anwar, for example, there's so many narrations. And this is, it's a very deep discussion as well, where the prophets, the Anbiya, would seek intercession of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. They would seek intercession of Ahl al-Kisa in specific. And they would be given news about the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. We have narrations which say that Jibreel descended and spoke and interacted with the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, explaining to them that Imam Hussain alayhi salam will indeed be slaughtered in this particular way. And they cried and they wept and they shed tears. for the Imam. So when it comes to the prophecy of Karbala, most definitely, there's a lot of evidences to support this as well. Even when Imam Ali alayhi salam goes towards Siffin to fight Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, very very famous narration. He passes through the lands of Karb wa Bala, and then he turns to Ibn Abbas and he says, "Oh Ibn Abbas, what land is this?" And then he inquires and he says that this is the land of Karb wa Bala. And then he stops, he halts his horse, and then he makes sure all of his companions stop, and then he weeps and he cries and he tells the other companions to engage in crying. Why? Because it was the place where his son would be slaughtered. So yeah, the prophecy was there way before even it took place in the 10th of Muharram.
Thank you for the question. And again, it's an open invitation to all those that are currently viewing. Please do use the live chat for any further questions, comments, or any elaboration.
It was a very, very good question.
Sorry?
It was a very good question, Alhamdulillah.
It was indeed a good question. So in the topic of discussing the reasons and motives behind Imam Hussain alayhi salam's uprising, we've so far discussed some of the secondary reasons that some like to kind of put at the forefront. We've discussed how some like to think it as a political stunt. Somehow like to think Imam Hussain alayhi salam's sole purpose was only to get martyred. And you previously mentioned that the third argument that some use to kind of dilute the core and the essence of his message is that his stance in Karbala was potentially an act of defense. So, for example, if Imam Hussain alayhi salam wasn't provoked or he wasn't in the situation, then most surely he would not have done this, and there were other actions that he would have thus taken. So, right. Are you able to elaborate on this opinion as to what this can imply and what this means?
Yeah, of course. So it's a very interesting discussion because they approach this from a very political, trying to examine, the series of historical events from a political slash, just generally from an historical. So basically, what they say is that when you examine the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, Imam Hussain was just like his brother Imam Hassan, right? Imam Hassan, with his feud with Muawiyah. Obviously, Imam Hassan, when he lost the war with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Muawiyah gave him a choice. Muawiyah gave him the choice to either continue fighting or to sign a peace treaty. Now, Imam Hassan alayhi salam takes this opportunity and he signs a peace treaty as well. Now, scholars came forward and they said, well, historically speaking, there were no differences between Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain. They were two brothers. They had similar mindsets. They had similar strategies to fight injustice. So Imam Hussain alayhi salam had the choice either to stand and uprise against Yazid or to sit back and do exactly what his brother did and deal with the situation just like his brother Imam Hassan alayhi salam, right? So if Yazid ibn Muawiyah was open to a dialogue, was open to signing a peace treaty, then Imam Hussain alayhi salam would have definitely taken that path compared to rising against him or leading an uprising against him, right? The evidence of this, interestingly, the evidence of this is when Muawiyah assassinates his brother Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Obviously, the Muawiyah carries on living, right? And Muawiyah is again, he's the ruler of Sham, he's the ruler of Syria, he's the official caliph of the Muslim Ummah for another 10 years. So Imam Hussain alayhi salam becomes the Imam, the official Imam, the third official Imam of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhi salam. And at the same time, he's living for the next following 10 years. Muawiyah is still the leader, the caliph. 10 years later, after the imamate of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, Muawiyah passes away, Muawiyah dies, and Yazid ibn Muawiyah comes into power. The first order of business of Yazid was to demand allegiance from Imam Hussain. And literally, Yazid gave two ultimatums. Either you give bay'ah or you give me your neck. that choice is yours, right? Imam Hussain alayhi salam obviously does not give bay'ah, which meant that he was provoked into a battle, which meant that he was provoked into engaging in war and leading an uprising against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. If Yazid had in any way, shape, or form said, um, I don't want bay'ah, I just want you to sign your peace treaty, like Muawiyah did. Muawiyah didn't demand bay'ah from Imam Hassan alayhi salam. He forced him to a peace treaty, which then he interpreted as bay'ah. But obviously, there's a difference between signing a peace treaty and obviously giving allegiance to someone. You find that Yazid ibn Muawiyah doesn't even consider the idea of signing a peace treaty like his father did. So obviously, when he demanded bay'at from Imam Hussain alayhi salam, Imam Hussain rejected it outright. Then he demanded for his neck, upon which the Imam was provoked into a war. Right, so this opinion basically goes on to say that just as his brother was open to a dialogue or some form of a dialogue, then Imam Hussain alayhi salam could have easily been open to some form of a dialogue as well. Not only that, but even on the 10th of Muharram, there's further evidences to show on the 10th of Muharram, on the day of Ashura, it wasn't the companions that began the battle, the companions of Imam Hussain who began the battle. Their stance was a very defensive stance, right? And in fact, even some of these companions encouraged the Imam that, we should be the ones who attack them. We should be the ones who, shoot our arrows, upon which the Imam kind of rebukes them. He reprimands them. He says, no, that's not our liking. That's not our strategy. We wait for them to attack us first, and then we're going to attack them. So from the very beginning, from the very, very beginning until the very final moments, the Imam's position, the Imam's stance was a very defensive stance, right? It was as if the Imam was defending himself. And in the state of provocation, that's when the battle obviously begins. And the Imam makes it clear to them. He says that, I detest starting a fight with them. And he waits until they start a fight with the Imam alayhi salam. And obviously this view is not something, although it's entertained and although it's even elaborated by our scholars, it's not something that's accepted. And the reason being is because it gives you that connotation that, the helm of the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was the day of Ashura itself. The manifestation of his uprising was the day of Ashura itself, where it wasn't. The movement of Imam Hussain started way before Ashura. It started, months before Ashura. Right? The fighting, the pinnacle, the pivot of his movement was the day of Ashura, but the whole preface began way before Ashura itself. In fact, scholars say that his movement began the day Yazid ibn Muawiyah demanded for his allegiance. So you have this whole historical narrative where the governor of Medina has, summoned Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and he tells the Imam alayhi salam, he says, look, this is what Yazid wants from you. He either wants bay'at from you or he wants your neck. That choice is yours. What do you want? And the Imam alayhi salam beautifully, he in the middle of many people, he in the middle of a crowd, he gets up and he says, Mithli la ubaya mithle. A person like me will never give allegiance to a person like him. That was the initiative of his movement. That was when his movement began. Right? Whether Yazid intended to kill him or not, whether Yazid intended to fight him or not, that's all secondary. That was all secondary for the Imam alayhi salam. What was absolutely fundamental for the Imam was to show the people that a person like him does not give bay'ah to a person like Yazid ibn Muawiyah. A person like Yazid ibn Muawiyah does not deserve the caliphate. Right? That was the start of his movement.
Brilliant. In the interest of time, I think so far we've discussed a couple of points and arguments that those that like to dilute Imam Hussain alayhi salam's core message come up with other reasons and try to put that at the forefront. Before we before you present a conclusion on what his authentic message and reform message was, what would you say were Yazid's motive to outright kill Imam Hussain alayhi salam? Of course, at that time, Imam Hussain alayhi salam yielded a lot of power reputationally, but also through his lineage and through his personality.
Right, right. So again, historically, it's a very beautiful discussion as well. Yazid ibn Muawiyah, his motives was revenge. That's all it was. Yeah, it was as shallow as that. It was him just wanting vengeance before for what happened to his forefathers, before at the time of Imam alayhi salam, at the time of the Holy Prophet. Historically, scholars talk about this, and they talk about this beautifully. They say, look. They say there's two things. There's two ways in which the Holy Prophet embarrassed and humiliated the Banu Umayyah. The first was the battles of Badr and Uhud and Khandaq and Khaybar and all of these different battles that we all know of, where Imam alayhi salam was actively killing members of the Banu Umayyah. So the first way in which the Prophet humiliated the Banu Umayyah was shedding their blood and killing the most prestige of their members of their tribe. Right? That was the first. The second was what happened and what transpired on the conquest of Mecca, when personalities like Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah, they were literally on their knees. They were subdued. Right? They were subdued. They were overpowered. They were overwhelmed by the power of the Holy Prophet, and this was seen as a humiliation for them. And that resentment stayed in their hearts, right? They were not able to move on from that. So when Muawiyah comes into power, Muawiyah's strategy, he was very, very clever, very cunning. His strategy was to try and avenge his tribe, right? This whole Jahiliyyah concept that they tried to revive, which was, we were attacked, we were, oppressed, or we were subdued. Now we need to show the same treatment towards them, towards our enemies. So what does he do? He engages in a peace treaty with Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Now the peace treaty of Imam Hussain, according to Muawiyah's mind, was that he is now overpowering Imam Hussain the way Rasulullah overpowered him and his father on the conquest of Mecca. That sense of complete humiliation, that overpoweredness that he had over Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So that's how he avenged his father. Yazid ibn Muawiyah, he doesn't subdue Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Also bear in mind, Muawiyah could have easily killed Imam Hussain alayhi salam. He had the upper hand. He could have easily slaughtered Imam Hussain, but he doesn't, because he wants to show the people that, look, what happened in conquest of Mecca, I am now avenging what happened on the conquest of Mecca. Yazid takes it a step further. Yazid doesn't care about subduance, right? Yazid doesn't talk about, humiliating the Ahl al-Bayt alayhi salam. He goes straight for the blood. He goes straight for the jugular. And he wants to assassinate them. He wants to slaughter them the way his father and his grandfather was slaughtered in Badr and Uhud. And the evidences of this is also found when the head of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is brought to him in Sham. He says, in words of poetry, he says, now I've avenged. I wish my father and my grandfather were here to see me and be proud of me, because I've now avenged them. Right? So his method or his motives were just to avenge his tribe for what happened to them by the Alawiyya, the Hashimiyas in history.
Son, thank you for that, Sheikh. And then finally, as a way of conclusion, if I pass the mantle again, and if you could kind of now summarize, in fact, what we, from the Shi'i point of view, believe what the authentic mission statement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was when he stands up and rises against Yazid.
So, it's quite remarkable, because when you come across such variations of different opinions trying to explain the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. I remember one scholar, he said, well, if you want to understand the movement of the Imam, why don't you refer to his own words, right? Go back and listen to his own words. Listen to what he says about his own movement, rather than trying to give interpretations and trying to, give meanings behind his movement. Just listen to what he has to say. And the Imam alayhi salam, when he speaks to Muhammad ibn Hanafiya in Medina, his own brother, he says, "Inni lam akhruj asharan wala bataran wala mufsidan wala zaliman wa innama kharajtu li talab al-islafi ummati jaddi Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa." He says, I'm not leaving, Medina. I'm not leading an uprising to seek the caliphate, or to create fasad and fitna within the community, or to create zulm and oppression, or for me to, receive some favors. He says, nah, I'm leading a revolution to create some form of islah, to create a sense of purity, to try and reform the community and the religion of my grandfather Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And many of our maraja even today, from amongst them Ayatollah Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, may Allah lengthen his life, one of our fuqaha, he talks about this beautifully. He says the whole movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was to try and reform the ummah of Islam at that time, and this had many subsequent effects. From amongst them, for example, this dismantled and killed all opportunities to create fabrications and forgeries that were now coming into the religion of Islam. When you look at, for example, the three Khulafas that came before Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, a lot of bid'ah was, technically speaking, a lot of innovation came in towards the religion of Islam, which was not there in existence at the time of the Holy Prophet. But because of what happened in Karbala, doors of innovation were shut, they closed. We don't hear anyone from the Banu Umayyah or the Banu Abbas having the ability to create innovations and creating further acts of ibadat within the religion of Islam. Right? All of the acts of ibadat that came into the religion of Islam came after the Prophet, but before Karbala. This was the time frame when bid'ah actually came into the religion of Islam. Amongst the other, for example, benefits or reaction or even effects of Karbala was that it exposed the ignorance of the Banu Umayyah. At that time, obviously, Banu Umayyah, they were seen as a political, they had a political position, but they also had a religious position as well. Imam Hussain alayhi salam kind of separated the two. He said that although they may have a political position, they don't have a religious position at all. From amongst the other effects was that it created new morality amongst the people. It was to revive, the revolutionary spirit amongst every Muslim. And this is profoundly seen even after Karbala, as we spoke of just moments before, that it kind of relived, it revived the revolutionary spirit of the people. They began to lead uprising against the Banu Umayyah. They saw how much fasad and fitna was being prevalent within the community because of their actions. So slowly, because or through the battle of Karbala, it kind of reformed the ummah of the Holy Prophet of Islam. It dissipated the power of the Banu Umayyah, and of course later on the power of the Bani Abbas as well. Even today, we remember Imam Hussain alayhi salam, right? Whenever you see a tyrant ruler, whenever you see a despotic rulership, we obviously and naturally we remember Imam Hussain alayhi salam.
His movement stands as an inspiration to all, doesn't it? Regardless of creed and faith.
Ahsant. Yes, absolutely. It's remarkable that even 1400 years later we remember Imam Hussain alayhi salam.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sheikh, for your time.
And likewise.
Dear viewers of the MKSI YouTube channel, thank you so much for engaging and for tuning in. This is all that we have time for today. So we will bid you farewell until next week, where we will come with another subtopic titled discussing the exposition of Ashura. Sheikh Anwar Jaffer, thank you so much for your time. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forever increase in your knowledge and tawfiqah, to continue
likewise
with the opportunities to serve the community, and for us as the community members to continue from benefiting from such events and programs. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to join us at the mosque as soon as we can. But in the meantime, all those that have been affected by the pandemic, emotionally, financially, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate all troubles. And finally, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the 12th Hujjah's reappearance, and for when he does come, that we are also part of his ashab and ansar. Jazakumullah, Sheikh. Thank you so much.
Jazakumullah khair al-jaza,
inshallah. To the next week's session.
Inshallah. Likewise, inshallah. Iltamas ad-dua. Khuda hafiz.
the Hafiz.